Sound of sonar pings echoing in the dark, in the vast, inky blackness of the Atlantic. A silent war was waged, not with ice, but with ours. On both sides of the conflict, men huddled in cramped metal tubes, their entire world reduced to the sounds filtering through a pair of headphones. A distant thrum could be a friendly merchant ship, or the hunter that stalks you from the depths. This was the Battle of the Atlantic, where the ocean itself was the battlefield, and sound was the deadliest weapon. For the U-boat captains listening for the telltale propeller beats of a convoy, and for the Allied destroyers hunting them with sonar, the game was the same. Hear them before they hear you. In this invisible war, a single, unexpected noise could mean the difference between life and death. The loudest sound wasn't the explosion of a torpedo, but the chilling silence that followed. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the unseen battles that shaped our world. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories from the depths of history. Early 1943. For the sailors of the Allied Merchant Marine, the North Atlantic had become a hunting ground, and they were the prey. Take it, the death road. A treacherous, unforgiving expanse of icy water stretching from the coast of North America to the shores of Great Britain. On Tispat, the war wasn't fought in trenches or cities, but in the heart of a merciless ocean, where survival was measured in minutes. Imagine you're on the bridge of a rusty freighter, laden with thousands of tons of vital supplies, food, fuel, weapons. You're one of 50 ships, plodding along at a painfully slow 8 knots. All around you, the gray, heaving sea stretches to an endless horizon. The only comfort is the sight of the other ships in your convoy, and the lean silhouettes of the escorting corvettes and destroyers, darting around the formation like anxious sheepdogs. But this comfort is fragile. Beneath the waves, something else is moving. Unseen. Unheard. A U-boat wolf pack. These German submarines, commanded by determined and experienced captains, have turned the art of the ambush into a deadly science. They are the sharks in this steel ocean, and the convoy is their feeding ground. The attack often comes at night, under the cloak of darkness and storm. A sudden, deafening explosion rips through the quiet. A geyser of fire and water erupts from a nearby ship, its silhouette starkly lit against the black sky. Then another, and another. Chaos descends. Flares burst overhead, casting an airy fleeting light on scenes of pure horror. Ships, mortally wounded, list heavily, their bows or sterns slipping beneath the churning waves. Men scramble for lifeboats, or are simply thrown into the freezing, oil-slicked water. The escorts are overwhelmed. There are too few of them, and the ocean is too vast. Their early sonar, or ASTIC, is a primitive tool. It can ping a submerged submarine, but it's easily confused by thermal layers in the water, by the wakes of other ships, even by schools of fish. At night, on the surface, a U-boat is almost invisible, a low, dark shape lost in the waves. The hunters can't find the killers. Radio chatter crackles with desperation. Accessoria hit. AM sinking fast. Torpedo track. Port side. Man overboard. But the orders are brutal and necessary. Do not stop to pick up survivors. Maintain formation. To stop is to become a stationary target yourself. It's a choice between the lives of a few and the survival of the many, and the survival of Britain itself. The numbers from this period are staggering. In March 1943 alone, nearly 100 Allied ships were sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. Hundreds of thousands of tons of precious cargo lost, thousands of lives extinguished in the frigid depths. The sea itself seemed hostile, an active participant in the slaughter. The relentless waves, the biting wind, the freezing spray all conspired with the enemy to break the spirit of the men who sailed these waters. On grainy maps in the Admiralty's command center in London, pins representing lost ships cluster along the convoy routes. Each pin is a story of fire, steel, and sacrifice. The line on the graph showing Allied losses climbs ever higher, threatening to sever the lifeline that keeps Britain in the war. It feels like a losing battle. The technology isn't enough. The tactics aren't working. The wolf packs are winning. This was the Black Pit, the lowest point for the Allies in the Battle of the Atlantic. It was a time of profound desperation, a period where it seemed the technological ingenuity of the U-boat had decisively triumphed. For the men on the convoys, each voyage was a gamble with death. They were ordinary people, farmers, factory workers, clerks asked to do an extraordinary thing, to sail into the mouth of hell, again and again, with nothing but courage and a prayer to see them through. The death road demanded a heavy toll, and in early 1943, the price was being paid in blood and iron, day after agonizing day. The hope of victory seemed as distant as the far-off shore, lost somewhere in the cold, dark, and seemingly endless Atlantic, the endless expanse of the Atlantic. For an Allied convoy in the early days of World War II, this was both a lifeline and a graveyard. Out there, somewhere beneath the waves, an unseen enemy was listening. This is the story of the U-boat's deadliest weapon, one that couldn't be seen or dodged. It was the sound of the Allies' own success. Imagine being a U-boat commander, submerged in the cold, dark depths. Your periscope is useless, offering only a glimpse of the churning surface. Yet, you know a convoy is coming miles away, long before it breaks the horizon. How? Through your ears. The hydrophone, a seemingly simple device, was the key. These underwater microphones could pick up the faintest vibrations traveling through the water. For the German Kriegsmarine, they were a revolution. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a propeller, the low hum of a massive steam engine, to a trained hydrophone operator. These weren't just noises, they were signatures. They could tell the difference between a lone merchant vessel and a formidable warship. They could even estimate the convoy's size, speed, and direction, all while remaining completely submerged and invisible. The ocean, once a vast hiding place, had become a giant echo chamber, and the Allies were shouting their location to the world. Every turn of a propeller, every piston stroke in the engine room, sent out an invitation to the waiting wolf. The U-boats didn't need to hunt with their eyes. They hunted with their ears, following a breadcrumb trail of sound that led them directly to their prey. The Allies were broadcasting their own doom, completely unaware of the silent audience below. The greatest threat wasn't a torpedo in the water. It was the simple, unavoidable fact that their ships made noise. Back in the shipyards and engineering labs of Britain and America, a different kind of battle was being waged. The brightest minds were tasked with an almost impossible challenge: to make a multi-thousand-ton steel ship silent. They knew the U-boats were listening, and the race was on to deafen them. The primary culprit was the propeller, or as sailors called it, the screw. As it spun, it didn't just push water. It created a phenomenon called cavitation. Tiny vacuum bubbles would form and collapse on the blade's surface, releasing sharp, percussive pops. To a hydrophone, it sounded like a drum beat announcing the ship's presence from miles away. Engineers tried everything. They reshaped the blades, experimented with different numbers of them, and polished their surfaces to a mirror finish. They designed propellers that were more like elegant, curving sculptures than simple tools. But each new design, while perhaps slightly quieter, could never eliminate the fundamental sound of steel churning through water. The problem was physics itself. Next, they turned their attention to the heart of the ship, the engine room. Imagine the cacophony down there. The roar of the furnaces, the hiss of steam, the relentless pounding of massive reciprocating engines. This symphony of industrial power was a dinner bell for you. The vibrations traveled directly from the engine mounts, through the steel hull, and out into the ocean. Engineers tried to isolate the machinery. They mounted engines on huge rubber blocks, hoping to dampen the vibrations. They wrapped pipes in sound-absorbing materials and tried to redesign gearboxes to make them mesh more smoothly. They even experimented with entirely new propulsion systems, like the turboelectric drive, which promised a smoother, quieter operation. While some of these innovations helped, the sheer scale of the machinery meant that true silence was a pipe dream. A ship is a moving, breathing, metal beast, and beasts, by their very nature, are loud. Then there was the hull itself. As this massive steel form plowed through the water, it created a massive pressure wave, a low-frequency rumble that could travel for dozens of miles. Ship designers tried to create more hydrodynamic, sleeker hull shapes to cut through the water more cleanly. They tried adding special coatings, hoping to absorb sound or reduce friction. But again, they were fighting a losing battle against the basic laws of fluid dynamics. You simply cannot move an object the size of a building through a dense medium like water without making a disturbance. For every problem they tried to solve, two more seemed to appear. Quieter engines were heavier, reducing cargo capacity. More complex propellers were prone to damage. Every potential solution came with a compromise. All these efforts, all this ingenuity, felt like trying to muffle a thunderclap with a handkerchief. The engineers and designers worked tirelessly, but the fundamental truth remained. The Allied war effort depended on a vast, noisy machine of industry and logistics. Their strength was their ability to produce ships, to move men and material across the ocean in unprecedented numbers. But this very strength, this hum of production and progress, was also their greatest weakness. The sound of their powerful engines, the sound of their propellers biting into the water, the sound of their very success, was the siren song that drew the U-boats in. The Allies were trapped in a paradox. To win the war, they had to be loud, but being loud was getting them killed. The unseen, unheard enemy wasn't just the it was the sound waves rippling out from their own fleet. The battle for the Atlantic was not just a battle of steel and explosives. It was a battle of sound versus silence. And for a terrifyingly long time, silence was winning. Have you ever wondered where genius comes from? Is it born in fancy labs or elite universities? Or can it spark in the most unexpected places? Today, we're diving into the story of a man who changed the world, not with a slide rule or a complex equation, but with a potato peeler and a keen ear. This is the story of Tommy Lawson, the unassuming cook who listened to the sea and heard the future. Our story begins in the belly of a merchant ship, deep in the galley. This was Tommy Lawson's world. Not a world of charts and compasses, but of steam, sweat, and the endless mind-numbing task of peeling potatoes. Day in, day out, the rhythmic scrape of his peeler was the metronome to his life. But there was another sound, a constant companion that vibrated through the very steel of the hull. It was the heart of the ship, the low, guttural hum of the engines. For Tommy, this hum wasn't just noise. It was a sign of life. It was the sound of safety, of movement, of purpose. It was the deep, reassuring voice of the ship, a constant presence that vibrated through the soles of his worn-out boots, up his spine, and into his very soul. It meant they were alive, pushing through the waves, heading for the next port. It was the soundtrack to his existence, as familiar as his own breathing. He didn't think about it consciously, but if it were ever to stop, he'd know something was terribly wrong. One gray afternoon, as the ship sliced through the cold, choppy waters of the Atlantic, the unthinkable happened. A deafening explosion ripped through the air, and the entire vessel shuddered violently. Alarms blooded, a sound of pure chaos that sliced through the familiar engine hum. Men were shouting, running, their faces masks of panic. The ship listed hard to one side, sending sacks of potatoes and crates of supplies crashing across the galley floor. Tommy was thrown against a bulkhead, his world tilting on its axis. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped him. But amidst the chaos, amidst the shouting and the groaning of twisted metal, Tommy's ear, so attuned to the ship's voice, noticed something else. As the sea began to pour in through a gaping hole in the hull, as the ship began its slow, agonizing descent into the depths, the engine's hum faded. It sputtered, coughed, and then silence. For the first time in months, the deep, reassuring vibration was gone. The heart of the ship had stopped beating. Clinging to a piece of floating debris in the icy water, watching his home sink beneath the waves, a strange thought pushed through Tommy's shock and grief. He replayed the moment in his mind. The explosion, the chaos, and then the silence. He realized the sound, that familiar hum, had been traveling through the solid steel of the ship. But as the water rushed in, replacing the air and surrounding the engine room, the sound disappeared. It was as if the water had swallowed the noise whole. Why? Why did the sound travel so well through the solid hull, but vanish when the water took over? It was a simple question, born in the midst of a life-or-death struggle. While others were just trying to survive, Tommy's mind, The mind of a simple cook was grappling with a fundamental principle of physics. He didn't have the words for it in acoustics impedance. Sound waves, but his observation was profound. Sound behaved differently in different mediums. It traveled through the solid ship, but was muffled, absorbed by the encroaching sea. This single, powerful observation, made in the most terrifying moment of his life, planted a seed in Tommy Lawson's mind. It was a seed that would grow into an idea, an invention that would redefine naval warfare and underwater exploration. This cook, this potato peeler, had stumbled upon a secret of the deep. He had discovered a vital clue, not in a textbook, but by listening to the death of his ship. The hum of the engine was gone, but in its place, a new kind of signal was just beginning to form in his mind. Years passed. Tommy survived, but the memory of that day and the silence that followed the hum never left him. He couldn't shake the idea. He began experimenting in his own humble way, tapping on metal pipes, submerged in wash tubs, listening to the echoes in a rain barrel, trying to recreate that moment. People thought he was strange, this quiet man obsessed with sounds and water. They didn't see the genius at work. They only saw a cook haunted by the sea. But Tommy persisted. He learned. He read every book he could find on sound and physics. He transformed from a cook into a self-taught inventor. His kitchen became his laboratory. His simple observation about the engine's hum evolved into a complex theory. He reasoned that if sound could be muffled by water, it could also be projected through it. And if you could send out a sound, you could listen for its echo. An echo bouncing off something solid, something like another ship or a submarine hiding in the depths. This was the birth of modern sonar, not in a government-funded lab, but from the inside of a man who once peeled potatoes. Tommy Lauzon, the man from the galley, took his trauma and his simple observation and turned it into one of the most significant technological leaps of the 20th century. His story is a powerful reminder that genius isn't about where you start. It's about how you see the world, how you listen to it, and the questions you dare to ask, even when everything is sinking around you. If you have, then you're in the same boat as a man named Lawson. And trust me, his story is one you'll want to hear. We're in the thick of World War II. The oceans are a deadly chessboard, and the loudest pieces on the board are the Allied destroyers. Their engines, these massive beasts of steel and steam, create a colossal racket. Every thrum, every vibration, travels 4 miles underwater. For the German U-boats, lurking in the deep, this noise is a dinner bell. It screams, "Here I am! Come and get me!" The Allies are losing ships at an alarming rate, and the best minds in naval engineering are stumped. They've tried everything: soundproofing, engine modifications, new propeller designs, but nothing works. The ships are still deafeningly loud. This is where our story truly begins, in a stuffy, smoke-filled room, where weary engineers are staring at blueprints, completely out of ideas. The mood is grim. The problem seems impossible. And into this room walks a man named Lawson. He's not a high-ranking admiral or a world-renowned physicist. He's just a man with an idea. An idea so simple, so utterly counterintuitive, that it sounds like a joke. He clears his throat, probably a little nervously, and says, "Gentlemen, what if we used water to silence the ships?" Imagine the silence in that room, quickly followed by a ripple of disbelief, then outright laughter. Water, the very element they were fighting against. The sea that swallowed their ship's whole. They thought he was a fool. "You want to use water to absorb the sound of the engines?" One of them probably scoffed. "Are you suggesting we flood the engine rooms?" The room erupted in jeers. It was madness. Lawson stood his ground. He wasn't suggesting they flood the ships. His idea was far more elegant. He pointed to the empty spaces, the hollow cavities and structural voids near the massive engines. "We fill these," he explained, "with water. Or any liquid, really. We build tanks inside the hull, right next to the engines, and we fill them." His theory was this: the engine's vibrations, that thunderous roar traveling through the steel hull, would have to pass through these new water-filled tanks. And what happens when you try to push a vibration through a dense liquid? It gets muffled. The water would act like a giant, liquid shock absorber. It would soak up the vibrations, deadening them before they could escape into the ocean. The ship wouldn't become silent, but it would become dramatically quieter. The engineers were not convinced. Their entire careers were built on complex mechanics and established principles. That's absurd, one might have argued. You're adding hundreds of tons of dead weight to the ship. It'll slow it down, make it less maneuverable. It's impractical. Another might have added, the structural integrity. You want us to build tanks into the very frame of the ship? It's a logistical nightmare. To them, Lawson's quiet idea was the ramblings of an amateur, a distraction from the real, serious work of engineering. This is a moment we've all faced, isn't it? That fine, razor-thin line between a stroke of genius and a fit of foolishness. How many world-changing ideas were first met with laughter? The idea of flying machines, of talking across continents through a wire, of a computer in every home. They all sounded crazy at first. Lawson's idea was no different. It defied conventional wisdom. It took the very thing that was their enemy, the water, and proposed turning it into their shield. The engineers saw a fool adding unnecessary weight to a ship. Lawson saw a symphony conductor using liquid to dampen a runaway percussion section. He understood that sometimes the most elegant solution isn't about adding more complex machinery, but about using the fundamental properties of the world in a new and imaginative way. While they were trying to fight the noise, Lawson was trying to persuade it, to absorb it, to calm it down. The laughter was a test. It was a wall of skepticism built by years of doing things a certain way, and Lawson had to decide, would he let that laughter crush his quiet idea, or would he push through, convinced of the simple, beautiful physics at its core? This wasn't just about naval engineering anymore. It was about the courage to trust your own unique perspective, even when the entire room of experts is telling you you're wrong. So, did they listen? Did they risk it all on this wild, watery notion? Well, the fate of countless sailors and the course of the war in the Atlantic might just hang on the answer. Lawson had to fight not just U-boats, but the stubbornness of the human mind, which often fears a new idea more than a familiar enemy. And that battle of wits, that struggle to be heard, is often the most difficult battle of all. They called it the asterisk. Wanderer asterisk, an old freighter hauling ore and spare parts between the outer colonies. But to us, the crew, it was home. A home that was falling apart. The asterisk Wanderer asterisk's primary acoustic baffles were shot. We were running so loud, every pirate and patrol in the sector could hear us coming from a parsec away. Corporate red tape had our replacement parts recorded for 6 standard months. 6 months we couldn't afford. We were a sitting duck, just waiting for the next predator to find us. That's where Lawson came in. Our lead engineer, quiet guy, brilliant mind. He'd served on military subs back in the day, knew a thing or two about staying silent. He saw the fear in our eyes, the way we jumped at every sensor ghost. He wasn't about to let bureaucracy sign our death warrant. So, he came up with a plan. It was crazy. It was dangerous. It was unauthorized. And it was our only hope. His idea was rooted in old-school submarine tech. Liquid acoustic dampening. Basically, surround the noisy parts of the engine with a fluid that absorbs the sound waves before they can escape the hull. The problem, we didn't have the specialized fluid or the chambers to hold it. What we did have was a cargo hold full of coolant, a ship full of pipes, and a crew that was desperate enough to try anything. Lawson drew up the schematics on a datapad, a web of rerouted coolant lines and makeshift containers welded from scrap plating. He called it unauthorized silence. The next few cycles were a blur of secret work, while the bridge crew maintained the official ship's log, lying through their teeth about routine maintenance. The rest of us were in the belly of the beast. We worked in shifts, cutting, welding, and rerouting pipes under Lawson's quiet, steady direction. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and hot metal. Every spark from a plasma cutter felt like a betrayal, a loud announcement of our covert operation. We were breaking dozens of corporate regulations, and if we were caught, we'd all be fired. Best case, worst case. Well, pirates don't exactly offer severance packages. Some of the crew were hesitant. Old Man Hemlock, our quartermaster, grumbled that we were playing with fire. He'd seen ships scuttled for less, but Lawson had a way of explaining things. He didn't give grand speeches. He just showed us the data, the projected odds of a pirate attack in our current state. The numbers were grim. He then showed them his design, explaining the physics with a calm certainty that was infectious. He wasn't just rigging a system. He was offering a lifeline. One by one, we all came around. Even Hemlock started misplacing tools and welding supplies exactly where we needed them. It was a silent conspiracy, a shared secret held in the humming guts of our dying ship. The final connection was the hardest. We had to divert the main coolant line. If we messed this up, the reactor would overheat, and we'd be a very quiet, very permanent cloud of vaporized metal. Lawson handled the final weld himself. I remember watching his hands, steady as a surgeon's, as he fused the last pipe into place. The entire engineering deck held its breath. He nodded, wiped the sweat from his brow, and keyed his com. "Bridge, this is Lawson. Prepare to engage the drive." On my mark, he looked at the pressure gauges, his eyes scanning the readouts of our monstrous makeshift system. The rerouted coolant began to flow, gurgling through the new network of pipes and filling the crude chambers WWII built around the engine core. The ship shuddered. Alarms blared on a secondary monitor, warnings about pressure fluctuations in coolant, levels that would have given any corporate inspector a heart attack. Lawson ignored them. His focus was on one thing, and one thing only: the decibel meter. "Engage," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "On." Debridged the captain, throttled the main drive. Normally, this was the moment the whole ship would groan and vibrate, a thunderous roar that you felt in your bones. But this time, there was silence, a deep, profound, unnerving silence. The familiar roar was gone, replaced by a soft, almost imperceptible hum. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. We all just stood there, stunned. It had worked. We looked at each other, wide-eyed. Smiles broke out, quiet laughter echoing in the now peaceful engine room. A message came through from the bridge, the captain's voice filled with a sense of awe. "External hydrophones are clear. They detect nothing. Lawson, you magnificent son of a gun, you did it." For the first time in weeks, we felt safe. We weren't just a target anymore. We were a ghost. That day, we didn't just fix a ship. We defied a system that had left us for dead. We took our fate into our own hands. Lawson never got a medal. There was no official commendation. His unauthorized silence was a secret we'd take to our graves. But every time we slipped past a patrol, every time we made a delivery no one else could, we knew. We knew that sometimes, tout ça believes, you have to break the rules. And sometimes, the most powerful act of defiance is silence. The hum was gone. In the cramped, dimly lit control room of the Red October, a silence descended that was more profound than any sound. The engineers, men who had lived their entire career surrounded by the thrum of machinery, stared at their instruments in disbelief. Their faces, illuminated by the green glow of cathode ray tubes, were a mixture of shock and awe. One of them, a young lieutenant with a nervous twitch, tapped his headset. Is it broken?" he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. The chief engineer, a man named Melikin, didn't answer. He was tracing a line on his oscilloscope with a trembling finger. The familiar jagged peaks and valleys that represented the submarine's acoustic signature had flattened into an almost perfect, straight line. It was impossible. A ghost. He turned to his team, his eyes wide. "Record everything," he commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every frequency, every decibel. I want a full spectral analysis. Now." The crew sprang into action, their initial shock replaced by a frenetic energy. Tapes whirred, and keyboards clattered as they captured the impossible data. They were documenting a miracle. The submarine, a behemoth of steel and nuclear fire, had vanished from the world of sound. The Caterpillar drive, a magnetohydrodynamic propulsion system that was more science fiction than engineering, was working. It was pushing the Red October through the water with the silence of a falling leaf. 97% less noise. The number was so absurd, so far beyond their wildest projections, that it seemed like a typo. But the data didn't lie. The report, a single sheet of teletyped data, felt heavier than a block of lead in Captain Marco Ramius's hand. He stood on the bridge. The periscope, his only link to the world above. He read the numbers again, letting them sink in. 97%. He handed the report to his political officer, Ivan Putin. Putin scanned the page, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a man of politics, not science, but even he understood the gravity of what he was reading. "This is revolutionary, Comrade Capti," Putin said, his voice laced with a reverence, usually reserved for party doctrine. "This changes everything." Ramius nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "Yes, Ivan," he said softly. "It does." The system was crude, a prototype bolted onto the hull with more hope than certainty. It was an unauthorized modification, a secret project born from the minds of a few brilliant, insubordinate engineers who believed in a future their superiors couldn't even imagine. They hadn't asked for permission. They knew it would be denied. They simply built it, believing that proof was the only permission that mattered. The news traveled up the chain of command, like a shockwave, not through official channels, but through whispered conversations and encrypted back-channel messages. The data was too sensitive, too world-altering, to be trusted to standard protocols. In the labyrinthine halls of the Soviet Naval High Command, admirals who had dismissed the Caterpillar project as a fantasy now scrambled to understand its implications. A submarine that could not be detected. It was the ultimate weapon, a strategic advantage so absolute it could redraw the map of the world. But it was also a weapon they didn't fully control. It was Ramius's weapon, his and his crew's. They were the ones who had dared to innovate, to push beyond the boundaries of what was thought possible. They were the ones who had proven that, sometimes, the greatest leaps forward are taken not by following orders, but by following a conviction. Back in the control room, the engineers were still working, refining their measurements, cross-referencing data. The initial astonishment had given way to a quiet, intense focus. They were no longer just technicians. They were pioneers charting an unknown sea. They had built a machine that defied the laws of naval warfare as they knew them. They had done it in secret, under the noses of a bureaucracy that favored caution over courage. They hadn't needed a committee or a 5-year plan. They just needed an idea, the skill to build it, and the audacity to turn it on. The silence of the Red October wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the sound of a new era dawning. It was the sound of innovation, raw and untamed. It was proof. And in the dark, cold depths of the Atlantic, proof was a voice louder than any command. The world was about to hear that voice, whether it was ready or not. And it all started with a group of engineers who dared to make the impossible real. The journey of the Red October had just begun, but its most important battle was already won. Not a battle of torpedoes and depth charges, but a battle of ideas. The idea that one breakthrough, one moment of undeniable proof, can be more powerful than any fleet. It's a lesson that echoes through history, from the first person to sharpen a rock into a tool to the minds behind our digital age. Progress isn't always born in boardrooms and government labs. Often, it is born in the quiet workshops and late-night sessions of those who see a better way and simply refuse to be told no. Imagine the vast, unforgiving expanse of the North Atlantic. For years, it was a hunting ground, a watery graveyard where German U-boats, the infamous wolfpacks, reigned supreme. Convoys of merchant ships, the lifelines of the Allied war effort, were stalked, torpedoed, and sent to the icy depths with terrifying regularity. The crackle of a U-boat commander's report, the chilling confirmation of ships sunk, was the soundtrack of this brutal campaign. But then, something strange began to happen. A quiet descended upon the ocean. It wasn't the silence of peace, but something far more unnerving for the hunters. The wolfpacks, once so adept at finding their prey, were suddenly blind. They would receive intelligence. A convoy, fat with supplies, was steaming east. The pack would converge, a coordinated force of steel sharks ready to strike. Yet, when they arrived at the projected coordinates, They found nothing but empty waves and a cold, indifferent sea. Day after day, the reports from U-boat captains grew more desperate, more bewildered. "The sea has gone dead," one commander radioed back to Admiral Denizi's headquarters. "We search, but we find nothing." Another lamented, "It is as if the convoys have vanished into thin air." The once confident hunters were now lost in an ocean that had inexplicably fallen silent. Their periscopes scanned a barren horizon. Their hydrophones, which once picked up the telltale thrum of propeller screws from miles away, now heard only the groan of their own hulls and the mournful songs of whales. For the men crammed inside these steel coffins, the psychological toll was immense. The thrill of the hunt was replaced by a gnawing anxiety. Every ping of their own sonar was a potential announcement of their presence to an unseen enemy. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with dread. They were adrift in a ghost ocean, and the lack of contact, the absence of targets, was more terrifying than any depth charge attack. It was the sound of their own obsolescence, the quiet, creeping realization that the tide of the war had turned against them. So, what was this ghost in the machine? What had silenced the Atlantic? It wasn't a new, more powerful torpedo, or a faster destroyer. The weapon that broke the wolf packs wasn't loud and explosive. It was quiet and insidious. It was a change in information. The Allies hadn't built a better mousetrap. They had learned how to make the mice invisible. The architect of this silence was a man you've likely never heard of. An analyst named John Lawson. Lawson wasn't a soldier or a sailor. He was a mathematician, a codebreaker, a man who saw the war not as a battlefield, but as a massive data problem. While commanders focused on tactics and firepower, Lawson focused on patterns, probabilities, and the subtle rhythms of the U-boat command structure. He worked within the secretive walls of Bletchley Park, the heart of the Allied code-breaking effort. The cracking of the Enigma code is a famous story, but Lawson's genius was in how he used that intelligence. He realized that simply knowing where the U-boats were wasn't enough. If a convoy dodged a known wolf pack, the Germans would quickly realize their codes were compromised. The trick was not to run away from the U-boats, but to route the convoys through the gaps in their patrol lines, the natural holes in their net. It was a delicate dance of ghosts. Lawson's system was a complex algorithm, a proto-computer program run on paper and brainpower. It took the decrypted German signals, patrol orders, fuel reports, sighting information, and created a real-time map of the U-boat presence across the entire Atlantic. It was a god's eye view of the battlefield. With these map, Allied convoy commodores could be given routing instructions that guided them through safe corridors of ocean, sometimes passing within mere miles of a U-boat pack, completely undetected. Imagine the scene in the convoy command room. A red pin marks a wolf pack here. A blue line shows the convoy's proposed route. Lawson's system projects the U-boat's future positions, and the blue line is redrawn, weaving a path through the danger zones, like a thread through a needle. The ships didn't need to fight because they were never in a position to be found. They became specters, sailing through a sea that, to the Germans, appeared utterly empty. The implementation was a masterclass in operational security. Allied ships were retrofitted with new, Ardennes said, high-frequency direction-finding equipment, nicknamed Hoofdduff. This allowed them to pinpoint the location of any U-boat that dared to transmit a radio message. But the true weapon was Lawson's routing system. The U-boat commanders, unaware their communications were being read, were broadcasting their own doom. Every old clear report, every status update, was another piece of the puzzle that Lawson was using to render them irrelevant. For the German command, it was maddening. They sent more U-boats, extended patrol times, and changed their tactics, but nothing worked. How could the meticulously planned operations fail so consistently? They suspected a spy, a traitor in their ranks. They investigated new Allied sonar technology. They blamed faulty equipment, inexperienced crews, even bad luck. The one thing they couldn't fathom was that their greatest strength, their sophisticated, encrypted communication network, had become their greatest weakness. The plummet in convoy sinkings was staggering. From a crisis point that threatened to starve Britain into submission, the numbers dropped, month after month. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't won with a climactic naval clash. It was won in quiet rooms filled with charts and radios. It was won by mathematicians and linguists. It was won by the profound, deafening silence that greeted the German wolf. This chapter of the war teaches us a powerful lesson. Victory isn't always achieved with a bigger bomb or a faster ship. Sometimes, the most decisive weapon is knowledge, the ability to see what your enemy sees, to know what they know, and to use that information to simply not be where they are looking. The sound of defeat for the U-boats wasn't the explosion of a depth charge. It was the crushing, maddening silence of an empty ocean. The quiet hum of an engine on a ship they would never find. It was the sound of the sea, gone dead. Have you ever heard of the Prairie Masker system? If you're into naval technology, you probably have. It's a sophisticated piece of equipment still used on modern warships, designed to make them whisper quiet and invisible to enemy submarines. But what if I told you that the genius idea behind this multi-million-dollar technology come from a team of MIT engineers or a high-ranking naval officer, but from a cook, a humble merchant seaman named Charles Lawson? This is the story of his incredible, forgotten legacy. Our story picks up in the darkest days of World War II. The Atlantic is a hunting ground, and German U-boats, the infamous wolf packs, are sinking Allied ships at an alarming rate. They're masters of ambush, listening for the telltale thrum of a ship's propellers, a sound that spells doom for anyone on board. The Allies are desperate for a solution, a way to silence their ships and slip past the hunters. They're throwing everything they have at the problem-top scientists, advanced hydrophones. Complex, tactical maneuvers, but the U-boats keep racking up kills. The stakes couldn't be higher. Every ship lost means fewer supplies, fewer soldiers, and a longer, bloodier war. In the midst of this life-or-death struggle, far from the war rooms and research labs, is Charles Lawson. Lawson isn't a naval architect or a scientist. He's a cook aboard a merchant marine vessel. He spends his days preparing meals for the crew, a simple, necessary job. But Lawson is also a keen observer. Day after day, he feels the constant, deep vibration of the ship's engines. He hears the rhythmic churn of the propellers, and he knows, with a chilling certainty, that this sound is a dinner bell for the U-boats lurking below. He sees the fear in his shipmates' eyes, the constant tension of sailing through what they call Torpedo Alley. For Lawson, this isn't an abstract engineering problem. It's about survival. While the top minds in the Allied navies were focused on complex electronic countermeasures, Lawson approached the problem with a cook's practicality. He'd seen how bubbles in a pot of boiling water break up into stored sound. He wondered, what if you could do the same for a whole ship? What if you could wrap a ship in a curtain of bubbles to muffle its engine noise? It was a simple, almost childlike idea, but it was rooted in a fundamental understanding of physics. He didn't have a lab or a budget. All he had was his observation, his ingenuity, and a deep desire to protect his crewmates. So Lawson began to experiment, using spare pipes, valves, and whatever else he could get his hands on. He jury-rigged a system. His idea was to bleed compressed air from the ship's own systems and channel it out through perforated pipes running along the hull, near the propellers. The escaping air would create a thick, churning screen of bubbles right where the ship's noise was loudest. His fellow crew members were probably skeptical. Here was the ship's cook, tinkering with pipes and talking about a bubble cloak. It must have seemed like a crazy long shot, but in a war where every idea was worth trying, Lawson was given a chance to prove his theory. The first time they tested it, the effect was immediate and astonishing. From below the surface, the loud, distinct signature of the ship's propellers was transformed. It became a soft, indistinct hiss, almost like the sound of rain on the water or the natural noise of the sea itself. Lawson's homemade system had created an acoustic camouflage. The bubble curtain didn't just muffle the sound, it scattered it, confused it, making it incredibly difficult for a U-boat hydrophone operator to get a clear lock on the ship, location, speed, or direction. It was genius in its simplicity. For the first time, a merchant ship had a real, practical defense against its primary predator. Lawson's bubble curtain worked. Word of the cook's incredible inventions spread like wildfire. The U.S. Navy, initially skeptical, couldn't ignore the field reports. They sent their own engineers and scientists to investigate. They were stunned. Here was a solution that was far more effective and vastly cheaper than many of the high-tech projects they had in development. They immediately recognized the potential. This wasn't just a clever trick. It was a revolutionary concept in underwater acoustic warfare. The Navy quickly moved to formalize and standardize Losen's system, giving it an official name. The Navy's version was more robust, more integrated, but the core principle was identical to Losen's original design. They called it Project Prairie. Later, when combined with a system to mask hull noise, it became the Prairie Masker system. This technology was retrofitted onto countless destroyers, frigates, and other warships. It gave Allied convoys a fighting chance, allowing them to cross the Atlantic with a newfound stealth. How many ships, how many lives were saved because of this bubble curtain? It's impossible to count. But Charles Lawson's idea played a crucial, unsung role in turning the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. And what became of Charles Lawson, the man who outsmarted the wolf packs with little more than pipes and air? This is the most poignant part of the story. After the war, Lawson simply went back to his life. He returned to the merchant marines, to his galleys and his cooking. He never sought fame or fortune. He never patented his idea. He was a humble man who saw a problem and fixed it with the tools he had. For decades, his contribution was largely forgotten, a footnote in classified naval archives. The Prairie Masker system went on to become standard equipment, a cornerstone of modern anti-submarine warfare, evolving with technology, but still based on his fundamental idea. Yet, the name Charles Lawson remained unknown. His story is a powerful reminder that genius can be found anywhere. It's not limited to those with fancy titles or advanced degrees. Sometimes, the most brilliant solutions come from the people on the front lines, the ones who experienced the problem firsthand. Charles Lawson was one of the quiet heroes of the war. He wasn't a general or an admiral, but his legacy is carried today in the silent passage of naval vessels all over the world. He was a cook who helped win a war. So next time you hear about advanced military tech, take a moment to wonder if, somewhere at its heart, there isn't a simple, brilliant idea from an ordinary person who just saw things a little differently. The pinging of the sonar fades, leaving us with a profound silence. The vast, empty ocean that was once a stage for the deadliest game of hide-and-seek now lies calm. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, wasn't just a contest of steel and explosives. It was a war of whispers, of echoes, a battle fought in the unseen depths with an invisible weapon: sound. For years, the U-boat wolfpacks held the Allies in a stranglehold, their silent approach a terrifying mystery. The key to survival, and ultimately victory, wasn't found in bigger guns or faster ships alone. It was discovered in the patient, meticulous work of scientists and engineers, many of whom had never set foot on a warship. They learned to harness the physics of sound, turning simple echoes into a map of the hidden enemy. They taught sailors to listen not just with their ears, but with their minds to distinguish the hum of a friendly propeller from the menacing signature of a lurking U-boat. This relentless pursuit of knowledge transformed the tide of the war. But the most crucial lesson wasn't about technology. It was about listening. It was about recognizing that a game-changing idea could come from anyone, anywhere. It could be a quiet mathematician in a dusty lab, a determined woman breaking codes at Bletchley Park, or even a cook in the galley of a ship, noticing something no one else did. Innovation isn't confined to boardrooms or top-secret facilities. Sometimes, the most powerful insights come from those who were never meant to have a voice, from the very places where hope seems lost. The sound of victory wasn't a deafening explosion. It was the quiet click of understanding, an idea that surfaced from the depths to change the world. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the sounds of history. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. See you next time. The results were undeniable. In the quiet, sterile environment of the test facility, the hum of machinery had faded into a whisper. Engineers, Men and women accustomed to the predictable symphony of gears and engines stood in stunned silence. They checked their instruments, then checked them again. The data remained stubbornly consistent. The readings were so low, so far beyond their most optimistic projections, that for a moment they thought their equipment must be malfunctioning. But it wasn't. The system didn't just reduce noise, it practically erased it. The final calculation, triple-checked and verified, sent a shockwave through the room. A 97% reduction in sound. It was a figure that bordered on the impossible, a breakthrough that would redefine the very nature of naval operations. Tao, which had been a constant companion throughout the project's long and arduous development, evaporated in an instant. In its place was a profound sense of accomplishment. A quiet, triumphant understanding that they had achieved something revolutionary. Word of the successful test spread like wildfire through the highest echelons of military command. This wasn't just an incremental improvement. It was a quantum leap. The implications were staggering. Into silent, deadly chess game played. Beneath the waves, the ability to move unheard was the ultimate advantage. A submarine that could glide through enemy waters with the acoustic signature of the background ocean itself was more than just a vessel. It was a ghost, a phantom predator. The strategic balance of power, so carefully maintained, was about to be irrevocably. The news crossed the Atlantic in secure, encrypted channels. Within weeks, the project was no longer a secret confined to one nation. The Royal Navy and the United States Navy, long-standing allies in the defense of the seas, began a frantic, collaborative effort to replicate the technology. Top engineers and physicists were assembled, labs were repurposed, and resources were diverted. The race was on, not against an enemy, but against time itself. The theory behind the system was elegant in its complexity. It involved a series of baffles, active noise cancellation frequencies, and new sound-absorbent composite materials that wrapped the engine compartment like a shroud. It was one thing to design it on paper, to run simulations and predict outcomes. It was another thing entirely to make it work in the real world, in the cramped, unforgiving confines of a submarine's hull. The initial prototypes had been clunky, inefficient, and prone to failure. There were moments of deep frustration, times when the entire team felt they were chasing an impossible dream. Skeptics in the Admiralty had questioned the exorbitant costs and the slow progress, suggesting the funds could be better used on proven, existing technologies. But the project's lead engineer, a man of quiet determination, Ad Eldfirm, he believed in the science, he believed in his team, and he believed in the transformative power of silence. Now, his unwavering faith was being vindicated in the most spectacular way imaginable. The replication process in the US and UK labs was a testament to scientific collaboration. Blueprints were shared, data was exchanged, and video conferences connected the brightest minds across the ocean. The American team, with their vast resources, managed to build a working prototype in a record-breaking 10 weeks. The British team, known for their ingenuity and precision engineering, followed suit shortly after. The results of their own tests mirrored the original findings with astonishing accuracy. 96%, 97.5%. The numbers fluctuated slightly, but the conclusion was the same. The system worked. The Atlantic, that vast, contested expanse of water, had a new kind of weapon. It wasn't a torpedo, a missile, or a mine. It was something far more subtle, far more potent. It was the weapon of silence. A new era of naval warfare was dawning, born not from a loud explosion, but from a profound and deafening quiet. This breakthrough did more than just create a tactical advantage. It created a new doctrine. Submarine commanders, who for decades had been trained in the art of quiet running, shutting down non-essential systems, moving at a crawl, were now handed a vessel that was inherently stealthy. They could move faster, deeper, and with more confidence than ever before. The psychological effect on opposing forces would be immense. How do you defend against an enemy you cannot hear? The fear of the unknown, the constant paranoia of a silent threat lurking just beyond the range of your sonars, would become a weapon in itself. The very oceans would feel different, imbued with a new and unseen menace. Every ping from a sonar array that returned nothing but the echo of the deep would now carry a heavy weight of uncertainty. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of potential danger. The engineers who had stood in that first test facility, marveling at the quiet, perhaps didn't fully grasp the global ramifications of their work at that moment. They were scientists, focused on a problem, a technical challenge to be overcome. They had chased decibels and frequencies, tweaked algorithms and reshaped alloys. Their victory was in the data, in the clean line on a graph that proved their concept. But the proof they had uncovered would silence more than just the hum of an engine. It would silence the doubts of their superiors, the arguments of their rivals, and, in time, the certainty of their adversaries. It was a stark reminder that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is the loudest boom, but the quietest footstep. The ocean's depths had always been a realm of secrets, but now a new, deeper layer of secrecy had been unlocked. The age of the silent hunter had truly begun. As this technology was integrated into the fleets, the world beneath the waves was forever changed. Patrols that were once fraught with peril, every propeller beat a potential death sentence, now became whispers in the current. Intelligence gathering took on a new dimension. Submarines could now approach enemy coastlines with near impunity, listening, watching, and recording, all while remaining completely undetected. The strategic map had to be redrawn. Naval bases once considered secure were now vulnerable. Shipping lanes, once thought safe, were now under a new, invisible threat. The men and women who served on these new, silent vessels became a special breed, guardians of a secret power, moving through the world's oceans like specters. They were the tip of a spear, forged in a crucible of science and innovation, a spear that made no sound as it flew. The triumph was not one of flashy parades or public declarations. It was a quiet, understated victory, celebrated in the hushed confines of command centers and the silent running of the submarines themselves. And it all began with a simple, undeniable number: 97%. Proof, as it turns out, really does silence all doubts. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into a pivotal moment in naval history. The story of innovation is often a quiet one, but its impact can be world. This is the legacy of Charles Lawson, a story not just of wartime ingenuity, but of a quiet revolution that continues to sail the high seas today. The war had ended. The world was breathing a collective sigh of relief, eager to rebuild and move on. For many, the inventions and desperate measures of the conflict were destined to become mere footnotes in history books. But not all of them. One idea, born from the urgent need to protect ships from acoustic torpedoes, was just beginning its journey. Charles Lawson's concept, a simple yet brilliant method of using bubbles to mask a ship's sound, was too good to be left in the past. After the war, naval engineers and scientists revisited Lawson's work. They saw not just a solution to a bygone threat, but the seed of a much broader application. The core principle was elegant. If you can change a ship's acoustic signature, you can make it fundamentally quieter. This wasn't just about fooling torpedoes anymore. It was about mastering the art of stealth in the underwater world. The age of the submarine was dawning, and the ability to move undetected was becoming the ultimate strategic advantage. So, the evolution began. Lawson's original, somewhat makeshift system was refined, studied, and re-engineered. Researchers delved deeper into the physics of bubble acoustics. They experimented with bubble size, distribution, and flow rates. They developed more sophisticated compressors and emitters. What was once a reactive defense mechanism was being transformed into a proactive, state-of-the-art stealth technology. The goal was no longer just to create a curtain of noise, but to create a precisely controlled veil of silence. This painstaking process of innovation gave birth to what we know today as the Prairie Masker system. The name itself is a nod to its origins. Prairie refers to the bubbles emitted from belts fitted along the ship's hull, creating a field of air that resembles wind blowing over a prairie. Masker refers to the bubbles released near the ship's propellers and machinery, masking the loudest sources of noise at their very origin. It's a dual-system approach, a beautiful and complex dance of physics and engineering. The Prairie Masker system is an acoustic marvel. By generating a fine layer of bubbles around the hull and machinery, it effectively decouples the ship from the water. The ship's vibrations, instead of traveling directly into the ocean and broadcasting its position for miles, are absorbed and scattered by this bubble cloak. The ship glides through the water, its acoustic footprint reduced to a whisper. It's the difference between shouting in a library and speaking softly in a bustling cafe. One is easily pinpointed. The other blends into the background noise of the ocean itself. And here's the truly incredible part. This technology, with its direct lineage tracing back to Lawson's initial breakthrough during the war, is not a relic. It's a vital, active component of modern naval fleets around the world. From destroyers to cruisers, the descendants of Lawson's idea are installed on some of the most advanced warships ever built. Every time one of these quiet giants crosses the ocean, it carries with it a piece of his legacy. His idea didn't just survive, it thrived, adapted, and became an industry standard. Think about that for a moment. A concept likely sketched out under immense pressure and with limited resources has outlived its original purpose by decades. It stands as a powerful testament to the lasting impact of a single, brilliant thought. Lawson wasn't trying to invent a stealth system for the 21st century. He was just trying to save lives and ships in his own time. Yet, the elegance and effectiveness of his solution gave it a life of its own. His name may not be as famous as some other inventors of his era. You won't find a story in most mainstream textbooks, but his legacy is far from silent. In fact, it is the very essence of silence itself. It's written not in ink on a page, but in the quiet passage of ships through the deep. It's a legacy that's heard, or rather not heard, in every corner of the world's oceans, every single day. The Prairie Masker system is the enduring echo of a voice that figured out how to use noise to create profound silence. It's a humbling reminder that innovation isn't always about grand, sweeping gestures. Sometimes, the most enduring changes come from simple, elegant solutions to immediate problems. Lawson's story encourages us to appreciate the hidden genius in the world around us, the quiet innovators whose work continues to shape our lives in unseen ways. History remembers the admirals, the generals, the brilliant codebreakers. Their names are carved into monuments, their faces printed in textbooks. They are the giants upon whose shoulders victory is said to stand. But wars aren't just fought in war rooms and on front lines. They're fought in the quiet, forgotten corners of the world, by people you've never heard of. This is the story of one such person. Not a soldier, not a spy, but a cook. A man named Lawson, whose greatest weapon wasn't a rifle, but a listening ear and a humble heart. It was 1942. The Atlantic was a graveyard. U-boats, the gray wolves of the German Navy, hunted in packs, turning the ocean into a death trap for Allied supply ships. For every ship that made it across, 2 more were sent to the bottom. Morale was plummeting. The war effort itself was at risk of starving. On board the destroyer HMS Orion, the mood was grim. The crew was exhausted, living on frayed nerves and the constant, thrumming dread of a torpedo in the dark. In the ship's galley, amidst the clatter of pots and the smell of stew, worked able seaman Alistair Lawson. Lawson wasn't your typical Navy man. He was quiet, unassuming, a man who preferred the steady rhythm of dicing onions to the roar of deck guns. He was older than most of the crew, his face lined with a gentle patience that seemed out of place in the chaos of war. To the sailors, he was just Cookie, the man who could somehow make powdered eggs taste decent, and whose coffee was the only thing that could cut through the bone-chilling Atlantic fog. They knew him for his stews, not for his strategy. They had no idea he was about to change the course of the war. Lawson's galley was a tiny, cramped metal box, located deep in the belly of the ship, right next to the sonar room. Day and night, the rhythmic ping. Ping. Ping of the hydrophone was the constant soundtrack to his life. While he kneaded dough and peeled potatoes, he listened. At first, it was just background noise, the heartbeat of the ship. But Lawson had a peculiar gift on, almost musical ear for patterns. He started to notice subtle variations in the pings, shifts in tone and frequency that the overworked sonar operators, trained to listen for the loud, clear signature of a nearby sub, often missed. He noticed how the pitch of the returning echo would change ever so slightly when it bounced off different densities of water. A cold current sounded different from a warm one. He noticed a faint, almost imperceptible flutter in the sound, just before a U-boat made a course correction. It was like hearing a whisper in a storm. He didn't understand the science behind it, The complex physics of sound waves traveling through water. He just heard it. He started keeping a small, grease-stained notebook, jotting down his observations next to his recipes. Potato soup, extra salt. One entry might read, followed by a faint warble at 0400. Sub turned south 10 minutes later. One evening, a young, green sonar operator, barely 20 years old, was on duty. He was struggling, his ears ringing from hours of intense listening. Lawson brought him a mug of hot tea. Heard that little tremor. Son, Lawson asked quietly, pointing a flour-dusted finger toward the sonar room wall. Sounds like they're deep. Moving slow, maybe changing shifts. The operator, initially dismissive, listened again. There it was. A subtle distortion, Lawson had described. Following this faint, ghost-like clue, the Orion changed course. An hour later, they found Italiano, a U-boat surfacing, caught completely by surprise. It wasn't a fluke. It happened again, and then again. Lawson would casually mention a hollow sound or a quick echo to the sonar team, and more often than not, it would lead them to a wolf pack lying in wait. He never presented it as intelligence. He'd frame it as a gut feeling, a cook's intuition. The water feels heavy tonight, he might say, and the officers, amused but increasingly respectful, would listen. They started calling it Lawson's larder, this uncanny ability to pull U-boat locations out of thin air. They didn't understand how he did it, and Lawson never explained. He just kept making stew and listening to the whispers of the sea. His technique was revolutionary. The Germans had learned to mask their engine sounds, to lie silent on the seabed, but they couldn't mask the way their metal hulls disturbed the water around them. They couldn't hide from a man who listened not just for the submarine, but for the silence it displaced. Convoys protected by ships with listening cooks. A quiet, unofficial program that spread through the fleet by word of mouth saw their loss rates plummet. Ships that were once sitting ducks could now actively hunt their predators. The tide of the Battle of the Atlantic began to turn. Thousands of lives, millions of tons of vital supplies were saved. The war ended. The ticker tape parades celebrated the generals and the fighter aces. Scientists who cracked codes were given medals in secret ceremonies. And Alistair Lawson, he went back to being a cook. He served out his years in the Navy, his unique contribution known only to a handful of officers who owed him their lives. He never spoke of it. His notebooks, filled with recipes and acoustic observations, were likely burned with the kitchen scraps. He asked for no recognition, no promotion, no fame. His reward was the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. History remembers the admirals, the scientists, the kings. It builds monuments to loud victories and bombastic leaders. But sometimes, victory doesn't roar. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it belongs to those who simply listen. It belongs to the quiet ones, the humble ones, the cooks in the galley who notice the details everyone else misses. Lawson never became famous. He never wrote a memoir, but his silence, his humility, and his unique genius saved thousands. And now, we see him. Years later, an old man, retired, living in a small cottage by the coast. He sits on his porch, a steaming mug in his weathered hands, watching the calm, peaceful sea. He doesn't see waves. He hears a symphony, a quiet melody of a world he helped save. Thank you so much for watching. If this story moved you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of the unsung heroes who shaped our world. We'll see you next time.